What I'd like to cover with you today is to explore the frontiers of human biology and talk about what is the potential of longevity. What's the potential of health span? What are we doing each day that is going to affect our health, our lifespan, and most importantly, what can we do to influence the way we age and ultimately stay younger longer? And so I'd like to ask you to be thinking about life, the world that we live in, the world around us, maybe in a different way than you might used to be thinking about it. So let's start out with something simple. We're all very generous with that very, very warm welcome this morning. And so we could all hear the clapping, lightweight chant, because we were sending electrical signals from our brain through the nervous system to fire off muscles, release chemical energy that allowed your hands to move back and forth. This created vibrations that traveled through the air, where we're able to convert those vibrations that are striking over into chemical energies. So this is a really good example of how the energetic systems in the body are controlling the biochemistry. And this is an incredibly important principle, because if we want to influence our health and improve the way that we age, stay younger longer, we have to be looking at the body, the balance between the body's energetic system and the biochemistry. But ultimately, this is going to come down to the energetic system controlling the biochemistry. So these are principles which have been discovered and built upon for many, many decades. So for example, we could go back to the 1960s, and we know that Becker was talking about how the bioelectrical system of the body was controlling the biochemistry. And this happens on so many different levels. So, for example, when we first talked about how we're sending information through the nervous system to trigger the conversion of that electrical signaling over to chemical energy, that's just one of many different examples. This happens through layers in the body. So let's use another example. We go out in the sun, and unfortunately it's a little cloudy here today in Florida. But if we go down to the beach, the sun is out, we know that the sunlight will cause our body to make vitamin D. This is a common example we use all the time, because everyone recognizes that light has this interaction with the human body. But why stop there? So I see we have some men that are here today over the age of 40. There's a few of you here today. So one of the things that men are interested in, I know ladies, you're going to find this very difficult to believe. Even when men get after the age of 40, they're still thinking about their libido and their sexual health and losing body fat, maintaining their muscle mass, staying young and virile. Well, we can use this information because if we go out in the sun and we allow UV light to hit the androgen receptors, which are up on our shoulders, that has been shown to cause an increase in testosterone in men. So a simple, non-drug way to elevate testosterone. Maybe this explains why during the summer, young men are very, very active pursuing young ladies. Especially at the beach, they have their shirts off, their testosterone and their vitamin D is very, very high. So you can't blame those young men. It's the sunlight that's really different. Hello. Should I say something? some other ground here. How it's not really practical to go out in the sun every day, take your shirt off and elevate testosterone. So what else can we do to make energy medicine a little bit more convenient? And to do this, we really want to understand how the body is working in the first place. And what's so interesting about this is that these are principles that have been known for thousands of years, but we relegate these things as just being in the realm of mysticism or spirituality, when mystics or spiritualists referred to the body as us being light beings. This was thought as something very esoteric, right? Not really tangible, just something spiritual. But as it turns out, we're probably more light than we are physical composition. I'll give you an example. Dr. Beverly Rubik, who is a biophysicist, we had the opportunity to do studies with her going back to 2005, and she was a presenter at our very first conference in Las Vegas in 2005. And she did a study looking at what effect the energy patches would have on the energy systems in the body, and measured those several different ways. So, for example, we're putting the energy patches on the body back then and doing an electromeridian assessment. This is was called EMOS. It was discovered and used in Japan. And basically what she found was that within minutes of applying the energy patches on the body, this would bring up the energy flow through the entire body. And we've learned a lot about how to optimize that over the years. So I got into a discussion with her about this subject and how it was working. And she told me a very interesting story about a gentleman from Japan that she was working with. That was an energy medicine healer. And this fellow had a very interesting demonstration, which I have yet to attempt, because I haven't mastered my mind to this degree yet. And it's also pretty scary. But he would take a needle and insert it into his hand and pass it through his hand without any type of blood. Nothing. It just went right through his hand. And so Beverly wanted to study this and find out exactly how is this possible and what's happening. And what he said was, well, we're mostly made of energy and light, so I'm just passing the needle through the empty spaces between matter. And that's how it goes through. And so Beverly said, well, that really never made a lot of sense to her, but there it was, she could see that working. So we're probably more light and energy than we are matter. In physics, this is very well accepted, because when we look at the very center of the cell, the protons, neutrons, there's an enormous amount of space between the center of a substance. Let's say, we'll talk about something as simple as hydrogen. Between the proton and the electron, there's a massive amount of space. So actually, most matter is empty space. And the energetic systems are what give everything its electrical charge and allow matter to do what it does. So how can this impact us? How can this benefit us? Let's look at the very design of our cells. Let's start there for a moment. And I'm going to use the word design because my personal belief is that we were created. As we look at the level of sophistication in our cells, the amount of information that was required to produce all living cells, it's absolutely extraordinary. And I've never seen a case where there was an explosion
and it led to an organized intelligence system. I've never seen that. So what makes this important is that that means that if the cells were designed, planned, programmed, and we can see the coding that went into it, much like how we would have a computer, we have the hardware and the software. If we can understand that and understand how this whole system is working, then we can influence it. If we went back 10 years, not very long, the whole subject of phototherapy, unless you were in the federal government, the whole subject of phototherapy was considered to be quackery. Yet, the information that came out later was that the United States government, through DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, it's a research arm of the Department of Defense, they were investing millions of dollars in the 90s into a phenomenon called photo repair. Now, we may wonder, so some of you might not trust politicians. How many people trust politicians? I want you all to relax and keep your shoulders nice and loose. That's why, we didn't see a lot of raised hands there. Okay. Because on the one hand, in the public circles, we were being told phototherapy is nonsense, it doesn't work, it's quackery. But behind the scenes in the 90s, there's millions of dollars going into research on how we can trigger very fast and rapid protein synthesis using nothing more than light. If you're interested in this, one of the principal researchers at the Department of the Navy was Dr. Harry Whelan. He's a medical doctor, used to be based out of the Midwest, I think in Michigan, I'm not sure where he is now. But Dr. Whelan made a number of very important discoveries in the field of photo repair and photobiology. I'll give you an example of how significant this effect is. More so today than ever, lasers are being used for communications in the military and also as destructive weapons. Just yesterday, there was something in the news where there is this tank-like thing that the U.S. has now with a 50 kilowatt destructive laser for shooting down swarms of drones. So we have entered the Star Wars era now. But one of the questions was, if someone was injured by one of these lasers for communication or as a destructive weapon, is it possible to use light, since light caused that damage? Is it possible to use light to repair that damage? And the answer was yes. And the way that the phenomena was discovered is really interesting because it's all based on tissue resonance. And this tells us about another property of human cells. So in other words, let's say there was an infrared laser at 850 nanometers that damages, let's use the eye as an example, because the eye would traditionally, of course, be very difficult to repair. Let's say the cornea was damaged by an 850 nanometer laser. What was found was that if you took that same wavelength of light, that 850 nanometers, but you just dialed down the intensity, where you're only stimulating the surface of the damaged area with a few packets of photons at a time, so incredibly small amount of energy, you would induce a signal in that tissue which would repair the damage. And the results they got were that 98% of the damage could be repaired through this mechanism. And this is with virtually no power. So how is that possible? It's possible because the human body is using light for communications. And all we have to do is send a signal. And once that signal is given, then the human body can convert that signal over to chemical energy, which is going to also be used for protein synthesis, for repair. It's very much like a transistor in electronics. It's a very similar mechanism in the sense that with a transistor, which is in every one of your cell phones, it's in all of your computers, you have two different sides of the transistor, and then in the middle, you have this gate. And so you send a very small signal to the gate, and the gate opens and allows current to flow. So in a transistor, you could say it's either on or off. So from this very simple principle, we can develop a binary system which is used in computer chips and forms basic computer language, right? Just from having transistors being in a state that's on or off. But when we turn that gate on and we allow energy to flow, we can use very small amounts of electricity to control large amounts of electricity. So we could use, let's say, a few milliamps to control amps of current through a circuit. So in human biology, it's very similar. We have, well, what is this control system? If it's light, where does it occur? And how is it being used? And how do we know that the light in our body is just not random oscillations? So the first thing is we can detect the light that's coming off of our body. So that's the first thing. This is a fact. We can use a number of different techniques. So for example, you can go out to the store today, you can buy night vision goggles, the infrared energy coming off the human body. Well, you could say that's just waste heat, right? Our bodies are converting food over into energy and we're giving off the waste as heat. And so that's really what we're detecting. That has nothing to do with cell communications. That wouldn't be entirely true. But let's say you want to make that argument. Okay, next thing that we can do is we can culture human cells, animal cells, plant cells. We can culture these things and put them into a room that's entirely dark and use a photomultiplier tube. And what we can see are highly coherent pulses of light that are coming off of the cells at many different wavelengths. And these wavelengths of light can be anywhere from the infrared through the visible up into the UV range. So very clearly, the body heat, which is in the infrared, if we took the wavelength of carbon dioxide, so let's say that's 4.6 microns or so. The wavelengths of light that are coming off of the cells are way beyond the spectra of human metabolism, meaning those wavelengths of light originated from a different source. How many of you here practice some type of martial art? Okay. How many of you know who Superman is? All right, great. At least some of you. All right. For those of you that didn't raise your hands, I know you really know who Superman is, but you didn't want to raise your hand. But I respect that. That's totally okay. But you know, Superman has this ability to shoot laser beams out of his eyes, right? Funny enough. I was in San Francisco back in 2005, and I was doing a LifeWave meeting there, and there was a doctor that was there. His name was Dr. Hirota, and I was introduced to him through a LifeWave member, and he had this ability to project chi from his hands, okay, living energy. So he did, he said, well, you want to see me give an example of this? And he had developed this method of cultivating energy in his body and projecting it. I said, sure, but I'd love to see this. So his wife weighed about 95 pounds. And so she was a very tiny, petite woman. And he said, if you could you pick my wife up? And I said, okay, sure. So I put my hands under her armpits, I lifted her up into the air, and no big deal. So then he did this thing where he created a ball of chi, he threw it at her, and he said, okay, try to pick my wife up there. And I tried, and it was like her feet were cemented into the ground, and I couldn't budge her no matter what I tried. So then he showed me a picture. So I asked him some more questions about this. And he would never really tell me everything. But he showed me a picture that was very interesting because he did a scientific analysis of this. He's a PhD, and he wanted to understand himself exactly what's going on. He knew what he had worked, but he wanted to understand it. And as it turned out, they used a form of spectroscopy, and they photographed gamma ray energy that looked like laser beams shooting out of his eyes towards a target. So it was this high frequency energetic beam that was creating this effect. So let's go back to our cells for a moment. This is to say we're probably all a lot more extraordinary than we give ourselves credit for. So, let's see. Let's go right down into the DNA. So, another interesting person in this field is Fritz Popp. So, Fritz Popp makes this observation in Germany that living cells are emitting light, and he wants to understand the code, because what he believes is that if you can understand, for example, what wavelengths of light are cancer cells giving off, as opposed to healthy cells, what happens if we turn that wavelength of light off? Would we be able to effectively shut down the communication system of the cancer cell and kill it, non-invasively using light? Would that be possible? But where does the light come from? This is an important question. So, as it turns out in the DNA, of course, the DNA is a helical coil, and one of the things that's known is that the DNA is held together by hydrogen. And the DNA zips and unzips when a new cell is being formed. And these hydrogen atoms, what they will do is spin clockwise and counterclockwise. Now, we did an interesting experiment in our lab. I would not recommend it. It's not for the faint of heart. But what we did was we created a chamber so we could have a hydrogen plasma, and there's a huge risk of explosion when doing these things. But I wanted to find out what happens when you rotate and counter-rotate hydrogen, and as it turns out, you release energy from the vacuum. And there's a number of implications to this. I spoke with a PhD at Georgia Tech, a PhD in physics, and so there was an experiment that was set up. And they took a chamber and they pulled a high vacuum on the chamber. So what this means is that there's not supposed to be anything inside the chamber, right? So we're told, like for example, in the vacuum of space, in the space between Earth and the sun. And if there's any flat earthers here, then you know the sun is within the dome. For everybody else, it's out in space. Okay? So I remain indifferent until I see the evidence. But we're told that in a vacuum, there's nothing there. Okay? We're told that there's nothing there. But that is not true. Actually, what happens is if you pull a heavy vacuum on an empty chamber, and you put in a device, what you can do is measure hydrogen atoms spontaneously appearing. So this has a number of implications, obviously. For example, if we were thinking of where did we come from? What was the start of the universe? So, of course, the story is told in Genesis and in other creation stories, but it's essentially that in the beginning there was nothing, and then all of a sudden there's matter. Where did it come from? Of course, in physics, we know this as the Big Bang, right? There's some explosion, the universe, we get a release of matter, and that matter starts to expand. But the question is, where did it come from in the first place? So by doing this very simple experiment, we can prove that there is something beyond the space that we occupy. And there is a door, and that door is hydrogen. And the hydrogen will come from this other dimension, this other space, and make its way into our space. When you take that hydrogen and you align two atoms, you can effectively create a doorway between this world and the next. And the implications to this is that what's on that other side is light, because that's where the light in our cells come from. We're all spiritual beings. We're all created by God in love. And that's kind of the whole point of this. We're supposed to be here to help one another, not fight one another. Right? So, what do we do with this information? Let's look at a real-world application, something that has affected all of us, which is COVID. And let's say, for example, we were not currently living in the free state of Florida, but we were living in the criminal compound in California. And you're in California, COVID hits, and what we know is that vitamin D is an extremely powerful antiviral. Those people dying from COVID have low levels of vitamin D. We know that vitamin D not only improves the immune system, it's an anti-inflammatory, it attaches itself to viruses, slowing down the ability of the virus to replicate. The state of California tells people, don't go outside, and we're closing the beaches, you're not allowed to go there, right? So this had an extraordinarily negative impact on our quality of life. Probably people died because they were not allowed to go outside and go to the beach. I find it criminal. So that's another story. So, and our health experts should know all these things, because I'm looking at the same data as everybody else. And a doctor is looking at the same data as everybody else. So that's a very good example of how something as simple and free as going out in the sunlight, getting your vitamin D, could have had made a dramatic difference on outcomes during COVID. So that aside, how do we use this information to affect our quality of life? And importantly, what do we do in terms of the aging process? So let's segue into that for just a moment, because I'll make the assumption most of you would prefer not to age. Most of you would prefer to stay as young and healthy for as long as possible. That's a fair assumption, right? Okay, fair assumption. So let's look at this thing. So we will go back 50 to 60 years and go back in the state of, what was the state of biology back then. And I took biology in high school, like many of you, and I happen to have a great biology teacher, and probably, no surprise, I was a straight A student in biology. When I got to chemistry, that's where the problems began. But when we are going to look at this, if we go back 50, 60 years, what was always taught is that you're born, you age, you die. That aging is a one-way street. And in science, what we're supposed to do is divorce science from politics, from any other opinions or thoughts. It's supposed to be about making observations and then reporting those observations in a neutral environment. Having experiments that can be reproduced, publishing those experiments, and then allowing others to reproduce the work so that we know that the outcomes are being validated. And then we learn and grow and use this information to improve quality of life for humanity. So this was the observation, and I would say rightfully so. We can clearly observe that when people are born, they go through a process that changes their body, right? This is a very clear observation. We can see what happens as people get older, and then, of course, ultimately people die. So this is the life cycle in human beings. However, another observation we could make is that if we took 10 people and we put them all up here, and let's say we took 10 people that were all 60 years old, we could also make the observation that all 10 people look different. And if we took their blood, the blood readings would be different. If we were to measure inflammatory markers, if we were to take, someone was asking me before about heart rate variability, because we did studies on that. Effectively, if we were to measure all of the relevant things that we wanted to know, what is the health of their cardiovascular system? What's their body mass index? Do they have chronic elevated levels of inflammatory markers? Whatever it might be that we're looking at, we know that all 10 people would probably be very different. So an observation that we could make is that each of those individuals made decisions in their life that led to this outcome. Of course, genetics is absolutely going to play a role, but putting that to the side, we know that how much we eat and what we eat is going to influence our outcomes. So if someone is struggling with type 2 or type 1 diabetes, if it's not genetic, we know how people got there, right? Too much sugar in the diet, too much consumption, not enough exercise, we know all these things. And the good news is that it is reversible. Type 2 diabetes is definitely reversible, right, if we do the right things. So what do we do then with this information? Well, we can say, let's make some other observations in nature. If the goal is to stay younger longer, or not age, or reverse aging, is there any examples that we can look at where that already occurs? If so, can we duplicate the process? And if we can duplicate the process, then how do we implement it? So we did stem cell research at the National University of Ireland in Galway. And going back to 2010, 2011 or so, I made a presentation to Dr. Tim O'Brien at the National University of Ireland. He was in charge of the Regenerative Medicine Institute. And Dr. O'Brien is an MD, and he specializes in diabetes and also diabetic neuropathy. And we had a very simple premise. What we wanted to see was, could we activate stem cells in the body using energy. So up to this point, his training was, well, for diabetes, you have certain drugs, but once people get neuropathy, there's really no medical intervention, such as a drug, such as a medical device that people can use. You have to provide physical therapy, you have to give dietary recommendations. But basically, if the neuropathy continues to progress, then people will get an ulceration. And this is from the nerves dying and from impaired circulation. Once that happens and you get an ulceration, then it's a matter of trying to prevent that from developing into something more serious, which would be amputation. So people that have ulcerations, they have to have bandages, antibiotics, they have to keep their wound dressing clean. It is a mess. And unfortunately, depending on what country you're in, 15 to 25% of the population that gets a diabetic ulceration has to get amputation. So what we wanted to do was find out, could we mobilize the stem cells? Could we manage inflammation, mobilize the stem cells, and get them to heal these ulcerations? And so what we did was we used an electromagnetic approach. This was far before X39. This was in the very beginnings when X39 was not even in my dreams. So we developed in our labs this toroidal double helix conductor. So if you were to visualize it, it looks like DNA that's wound into a toroid. And through a lot of experimentation, what we were able to find was that if we dialed in the right frequencies or wavelengths, we could induce neurite outgrowth and neurogenesis, meaning that we could repair the nerves that had been damaged. And we could tell the body, with this energy field, to grow new nerves. And that's exactly what happened. So this was, again, a case where we're not trying to use the energy that's in the system to actually heal the body. We're attempting to use a device at very, very low power that's going to give the body the instructions to turn on nerve growth. And we did, by the way, if you're interested, some of you might know Glenn Ryan, who's a PhD. He's an expert in vitro studies. So we hired Dr. Ryan. We did a study in vitro, so in a test tube effectively, where we were showing neurogenesis and neurite outgrowth. Then we did 2 studies with Norm Shealy. We did studies over at NUIG. And basically what we're showing through in vitro, animal model, and then human beings is that we could turn on this signal and regrow damaged nerves. So that obviously has can have a huge impact on people's lives that are suffering from this disease. So let's go back to this now with stem cells. So the problem with having a solution that's based on this electromagnetic therapy device is that it's big, complicated, expensive, requires lots of regulatory approval, and has to be administered by a medical doctor. And so it was never going to be something that could get out to the public. So how do we then do something similar? How can we activate stem cells in the body and achieve better wound healing? How can this have an impact on the way that we age? And how am I doing on that? Oh, okay. Oh, good. I'm good. Got lots of time. All right. We're okay? All right. So, thank you. All right. So let's go through this thing. So if the goal is to not age as rapidly, if the goal is that once we become physically damaged in some way, we're injured in an accident or aging's taking its toll, how are we going to improve upon our body's ability to repair? How are we going to do all these things? So this is more or less going to start with telomere biology and with stem cells. We worked with one doctor over at NUIG, at Regenerative Medicine Institute, and we were having this discussion one day on telomere biology, and we were both looking at doing essentially the same thing but different ways. He was looking for a drug-based solution, I was looking for a light-based solution. And I asked him, what do you think about telomeres as far as human aging is concerned? Do you think it's the only cause, or do you think that there are other things that are going on? And what was interesting was his opinion was that human aging is completely controlled by the telomeres, which are these rods on the end of the chromosomes. And as we age, the telomeres kind of shrink away, and eventually by the time we're 70, 75, we don't have any more telomeres, the cells stop dividing, and that's the end of the road for us, right, so to speak. So his opinion, what was interesting, was that aging is completely controlled by the telomeres, and that's the holy grail. I don't particularly agree with that. I think there's some other factors. But one good thing that came out of this research was that for those of you that are over 75, you can still regrow and get your telomeres back. Yeah. That was great. So if you were wondering, well, it's already too late for me, what do I do? Actually, experimentation has shown it isn't. So that's really good news. So we want to understand exactly what are stem cells and what influence do they have on our health and the way we age, what can we do about it, and what does this have to do with longevity, staying younger longer, or reversing aging. So I'll take one step back for a moment because it's interesting and it'll help you understand the impact of this. So one of the researchers in this field is Dr. Bruce Ames. And his interest in longevity was to look at the connection of nutrition to mitochondrial health. The mitochondria being the power plant of the cell. It's where our cells make energy. And is there a connection between the amount of energy our cells produce and our age? So we can make an observation that as we age, and if we took people, let's say, that are over the age of 50, and we looked at their mitochondrial function, we would find that they're not producing as much energy as, let's say, someone that was in their 20s. So that's the bad news. If you'd like some more bad news, what happens then is that the cell, to survive, says, well, we're in this predicament, the cell has become smaller, the mitochondria has become impaired, it's getting more difficult to turn this fat into energy. Let's go ahead so we can save the ship here and switch over and get more energy from sugar. So the worst news is that not only are we making less energy, but to survive, now the cell is making more energy from sugar and less energy from fat. So back in the day when I was developing technology for the Navy, through government contractors, I had a company with 4 other guys in Georgia, and we were developing survival equipment. I was looking at this mechanism, and I was thinking, okay, why don't we use light, communicate with the body, and turn on fat burning, and this will give us a natural way of boosting energy. But with the work that Dr. Ames did, what he showed was, okay, if this is the problem, then what if we fed into the cell the antioxidant alpha-lipoic acid and the amino acid acetyl L-carnitine. What if we use that combination to turn on fat burning and we force the cell to burn fat? What would happen to the mitochondria? And what would happen to the cell? And what he discovered was that this would turn on fat burning, and the cell would start to act and behave like a younger, healthier cell. So, this was critically important because it showed that there is a connection between the amount of energy that the mitochondria produces and how the cell performs, how the cell ages. Some modern work that's being done on this. So, for example, many of you know who David Sinclair is at Harvard, researchers at Stanford. They're going a little bit further than this today, and they're saying, well, we can make the observation that levels of NAD decline with age. So what if we have a supplement like NMN or NR, and we elevate NAD? What is that going to do to longevity? So there's some observations that we elevate NAD levels in the cell, and this is going to make the cell younger and healthier. I will tell you right now that is flawed. As bright as Dr. Sinclair is, there's a flaw there. And the reason, I'm sure he knows about it, but he's not talking about it, is because there's a ratio of NAD to NADH. And you can't simply elevate levels of NAD without compensating for levels of NADH. And as it turns out, the way to change the ratio to NAD to NADH is to give the body ozone. And God forbid the FDA allows us to put ozone in people's bodies. But you have to change the ratio of NAD to NADH, and that's one of the ways to do it. So you can either get an exogenous form of ozone, such as through injection, through rectal insufflation, or you can exercise really intense and get your ozone levels up naturally, although that's a bit more transitory. The other thing where we see these conflicts in science is that recently the supplement NMN, which is completely safe and used to elevate NAD, was taken off the market. And so Dr. Sinclair and his company, they pitched the FDA to do this. They removed NMN, and it will be back on the market, and you can get it as a drug and pay a ton of money for it. Right? That's kind of the goal. But in any case, the important part here is that we can see as we change the way the body metabolizes energy, we can improve energy output in the mitochondria. That is one of the foundations for reversing human aging. So the question becomes, is this the only mechanism? Is there something else that will also reverse human aging? And the answer is yes. Right? It's just not limited to this. So we go back 50 years, and there's Dr. Lauren Picard. And again, at that time, we're being taught that we are born, we age, we die. And that's it. And what was known for hundreds of years was a phenomenon called parabiosis. And parabiosis is where, let's say this was done back in London, where you would take 2 rats or 2 mice, and you take the blood of a young mouse, you connect it to an older mouse, and then you take the blood from the older mouse and you give it to the young mouse. And what happens is that the older mouse starts to become younger. Now, I'm going to tell you, there's something about this that you usually don't hear about, because that's the really appealing part of the story, right? That the old mouse or the old rat is becoming young and healthy. Well, the young mouse and the young rat aren't stupid, and they realize they're getting the life sucked out of them. And so they actively try to kill the old mouse before they die. So that's an observation that's seen. So it's an interesting observation. So before you run out and get a donation of young blood to somebody that's 18, you may want to think about that. But what it tells us is that what we've been traditionally told, what we've believed, is that aging goes in one direction, is true most of the time. But there are ways to change it. And that's really exciting because it means that the future could be where even if we don't increase our lifespan, which the two are co-mingled, by the way, but if we don't, let's say we don't end up increasing our lifespan, we will increase our health span. So up until 80, 90, 100 years old, we're still young and healthy. We can see this actually in experiments with carnosine. And carnosine is a nutrient that I recommend all of you take. Make sure you're getting enough beta-alanine in your diet. If you are a vegan or vegetarian, take a beta-alanine supplement, because beta-alanine is the amino acid that's a precursor to carnosine and a precursor to AHK. And both of these peptides and antioxidants are critically important when we're talking about aging. But in the case of carnosine, I bring it up because back in the early 2000s, experiments that were done with, again, mice. So this is encouraging because there are some direct correlations to human beings. But experiments that were done in mice were showing that the mice that got carnosine lived about 30 to 40% longer than the control group. So that was the first thing. Here's something very simple. It's only alanine and histidine. It's a dipeptide and an antioxidant, and it's inexpensive. Here's laboratory evidence showing that it increases lifespan by a dramatic amount. But more importantly, people, or the rodents rather, weren't aging. They didn't start aging until the very end of their life. So in human beings, it would be like living to 100, but you didn't start aging until you were 98. That's the corollary. So, how does that actually work? Wasn't known by back then, but today, what we know is that the carnosine is an antioxidant. Oh, thank you. I usually don't take water from strangers, but... All right. Thank you. So, what is known today is that the carnosine is preventing the telomeres from shortening. That's how it does what it does. So, the carnosine, unfortunately, was not lengthening the telomeres. And that's something that we want to do. But the carnosine was preventing the telomeres from shortening. So the advantage to this is really twofold, in addition to the lifespan benefits. So that's, of course, going to be incredible. The other thing is that what's known now in telomere biology is that when the telomeres are young and healthy, you don't get disease. So every autoimmune disorder is associated with shortened telomeres. So it has this other benefit. Not only does it mean that we can live longer, we can stay younger, but we are making ourselves immune, so to speak, from disease. Now, I'm not making that claim, by the way, about our carnosine patch. We obviously haven't done those studies. We don't make those claims. The only thing we claim about the carnosine patch is what's on the website and through our studies. And that's mostly has to do with the athletic benefits and the benefits for cognition. You see carnosine show up in the brain, the heart, the skeletal muscle, and you can see corresponding improvements there. Okay, so let's step back. That's yet another example of how we can do something very simple to have a dramatic impact on our health or longevity. So let's go back to Lauren Picard. So Lauren Picard makes this observation based on cardiasis that there's something in the blood that is able to not only reverse aging, but potentially keep people and mammals young and healthy. So he decides to start with the liver. Now here's another observation. The liver is the most regenerative organ in the human body. So chances are, if we're going to find a compound that is linked to regeneration and longevity, it's going to be in the liver. So, or the pineal gland, but he focused on the liver. So what he does is he takes liver cells from someone that's 80 years old, and he incubates those cells in a petri dish in blood from someone that's in their 20s. And lo and behold, he finds that those cells start to function like younger, healthier cells, in direct contradiction to the notion that we're born with age we die. Right? Here's a direct observation that the cells are becoming younger. And he spends several years and he isolates that what is responsible for this is a small peptide called GHKCU. So GHKCU, otherwise known as copper peptide, is made of three amino acids: glycine, histidine, and lysine. And it's ubiquitous. It's found throughout the human body. So Dr. Picard says, great, let me see if I can understand why this peptide is doing what it's doing. And he starts to make some, over the course of a number of years, let's say they're signaling molecules. So they're used to initiate instructions and have the cells do certain things. How many superhero fans do we have here? Do you have any? Okay, great. Well, we're outnumbered, so we've got to stick together. Okay, how about any X-Men fans? Got a few X-Men fans, okay. All right. So with the X-Men, right, it's all based on that they have mutations. And these mutations give them certain gifts. So for the X-Men, you've got Professor Charles Xavier, right? He controls things with his mind, or controls people with his mind. And then you've got this guy Scott, who is his character name is Cyclops, and his mutant power is he shoots beams out of his eyes. All right, and then you have my favorite, Wolverine, and he has the ability to heal really quickly, so he doesn't age really. So when we think about peptides, this is one way we can think about them, is that peptides induce reactions in the body, and usually they're limited to a few things. Their window of activity in the body can be very limited. And so what Dr. Picard was finding about copper peptide through his tests was extremely unusual. He was finding that this peptide could function like an antioxidant, and that it would protect cells from damage, and that it would also enhance immune function and reduce inflammation. He was also finding that the peptide could reduce the inflammatory response. So in conditions like arthritis, we could see a reduction in C-reactive proteins and cytokines. Another thing that was happening with this peptide, which at the time he attributed to the copper content, is that if you put copper peptide into a site, it would dramatically reduce the incidence of infection, better than an antibiotic. He was also seeing this peptide induce wound repair. It had other effects that I can't mention, which you can just simply do a Google search and you can see what those other things are. So he was looking over, let's say 20 years of research on this and seeing all these broad effects. And he's saying, well, this is really remarkable that this simple peptide is doing all of these things, but it doesn't make any sense. How is it possible for this one simple peptide to do all of these different things? And he came to the conclusion that it had to be something in the genes. That this had to be, have an influence on our epigenetics. So what does that mean? As we age, there's going to be an extraordinary number of changes that are going to occur in our body. But one of the most important things is the library of information that's encoded into our genes. There's switches that begin to get turned on and off. And so some things that we want on get turned off, and some things that are off get turned on. And this has an influence over everything about who we are and what we become. And you have an opportunity actually each day to influence your genes. Some in small ways, some in big ways. Any of you get up and exercise this morning? Some of you? Yeah. All right. Those who didn't raise your hand, be expecting that you are exercising in the evening, or you're going to go out of here and say, okay, I'm going to start exercising. But when you exercise, not only are you improving your bone density, your muscle strength, stamina, your body mass index, what you're also doing is turning on genes associated with longevity. In other words, when you exercise, you're telling your body, hey, I'm alive. Hello, I'm alive. Turn on those genes for longevity and survival. So just the act of exercise has a beneficial effect on our genes and how we age. What we eat, of course, is going to be important. If we're consuming processed food, I know sometimes there's no choice, but when we consume processed food, that's going to have a very different outcome than when we consume organic food. If we look at the Mediterranean diet, I had a meeting once at Schmidt Hospital in London. In Rome, Schmidt Hospital in Rome, and we were working with a medical doctor over there that's an oncologist, and I was having lunch with him. By the way, we were doing a study on the use of patches to help women recover from chemotherapy. So, I'm not involved, so this is kind of an interest of mine, helping with that. We had a discussion about this, and it's some very interesting things that he was looking at. But one of them was on the Mediterranean diet. And he had found that nearly all of the benefit of the Mediterranean diet was from olive oil. And now what's known is that olive oil may actually be better than resveratrol at turning on sirtuin genes, which are associated with longevity. So if we get real, authentic, extra virgin olive oil, which is difficult to get, if we can get that, then it's going to have unbelievable benefits on not only keeping us younger longer, but of course, the monounsaturated fats are great to help manage inflammation. So, okay, I'll say one thing I wouldn't normally say. I'm being recorded. See that I'm being recorded. Okay. Well, you know what? All right, they have to. I'm going to try it. All right, so.
Go big or go home.
Okay, so I had another conversation with this doctor who will go nameless to protect the innocent. He did an experiment on olives. And what he did was using a supercritical extraction process, meaning you take olives, you put them in an environment without oxygen, it's under a nitrogen blanket, and you press the olive, but with the seed. He found that there's a compound in the seed that kills cancer cells. And the olive oil, what the olive oil does is it acts as a carrier. The fat takes it inside the cell. So he went over to China, and they did a study, and they found they could take people in late-stage cancer and get about an 85% remission rate. And so I said, well, why aren't you doing anything with this? He goes, well, I don't want to be killed by the drug companies. But anyway, I'll just throw that out there. Okay, so we'll go back to Dr. Picard. So, and I love Dr. Picard. I love saying the name Dr. Picard because it reminds me of Captain Picard. So we go back to Dr. Picard. And so he begins to do the studies and say, okay, the answer here must be in the genes. And so what he finds is that not only is copper peptide a way of modulating and resetting genes to a more youthful state, it's an incredibly great modulator of genes. Let's do this, let's put this in comparison. When you exercise, which I encourage that all of you do, it's estimated that you're going to be activating about 76 or 78 genes in the body. The studies I've read, that's what they show. Copper peptide, in comparison, resets thousands of genes to a more youthful state. That doesn't mean you're going to put the X39 on and not exercise. I didn't say that. Right? Actually, to be very clear, if we want to have optimal health, we should exercise, we should eat healthy, we should get enough sleep, we should drink water, we should stay away from all of those things that we know are bad for us. But then when we're using tools like the LifeWave technology, then it's going to have the best impact. So the LifeWave patches stimulate the body with light. The blood tests we've done show that this stimulation of light elevates copper peptide. We see that in our blood tests. The elevation of copper peptide starts to turn on genes, thousands of them, that are associated with a young, healthy state. What does that have to do with stem cells? So the stem cells, of course, are where all of us start from. And so when the sperm fertilizes the egg, is that a politically correct term today, fertilize? I don't know anymore. Right? I'm turning 60 this year. I'm so out of reference with what's going on today. I know I say things that are politically incorrect without knowing that I do. So when that egg is fertilized, right, we'd say that, then already all of the information necessary to create a human being is in that fertilized egg, and the cells begin to differentiate and become a human being, right? There is nothing scientific that anybody can say that would be in opposition to the fact that a fertilized egg becomes a human being, okay? So what's happening then with the stem cells, and what's happening with these cells, is they start the process of differentiation. So you get these universal cells that go through phases to become more specialized tissue. So you have, let's say up here, a pluripotent cell, which becomes a multipotent cell, which is still able to change into different tissues, but it's more localized now. And then the multipotent stem cells become the specialized tissue, like a liver cell or brain cell or what have you. So the quality and the integrity of that stem cell is critically important. In other words, if you were to go out and you were to, do you have any architects here or anybody in construction? You're an architect, okay, great. Okay, so you know that if you were going to design a building, right, you would want to work, I assume, with new materials. You'd want to work with good cement and new wood, whatever it takes, right, to build this building. And if somebody said, well, you know, we've got this cement, it's not really the best, you know, we'll use that for the building, or we've got this wood, it's used, it's a little rotted out, right? You know that whatever building you're going to put up is not going to be very good quality, right? So it's the same thing with human beings, is that as we age, the quality of the stem cells begin to degrade. So if we're 60 or 70, this is why most people are not going to heal the same way they did when they were younger, because the quality of the stem cell that they're starting with has diminished significantly from when we're younger. And what's controlling this process is copper peptide. So copper peptide is what's resetting genes, about a third of them. So we only have to get the other 2/3 of the way there to stop aging. Copper peptide resets about a third of the genes to a more youthful state and causes the stem cells to mobilize. It activates a very specific gene called P63, and this gene causes the stem cells to proliferate. So let's walk through a scenario for a moment. Let's say you damage your knee. You go out of here and you hit your knee and it gets damaged. So what's going to happen is your body is going to start to produce oxidative stress, oxidative radicals. And this is there to reduce any incidence of infection. We normally think of oxidative stress as a bad thing, but at an injury site, in an acute case, an acute condition, oxidative stress is critically important because it helps act as a first line of defense and prevent bacterial infection. The oxidative chemicals, they'll also act as signaling molecules, and now you're going to bring in inflammation. Also, it sounds like a really bad thing, but it's not, because the inflammation is going to start to tear down the damaged tissue and make way for new healthy tissue. The other thing that the inflammation does, and specifically the inflammatory cytokines, is act as signaling molecules for stem cells. So the stem cells are attracted to the inflammation. Now, if you've had, let's say that you had a chronic injury and you're not healing, maybe you put on X39, you're not healing. The reason is because this is a little bit like a moth to a flame. The stem cells are attracted to the inflammatory cytokines. That's exactly where they need to go. But in a chronic condition, unless you get the inflammation down, the inflammation is going to kill off the stem cells. And this is part of the challenge of stem cell technology today, is that you can give people an injection of millions of stem cells, but within an hour, you may only have a few 100,000 left because the inflammation is killing them off. So this is why one of the things that we recommend is using a combination of X39 and Eon. So you can put X39 on the back of the neck, Eon at the point of pain or inflammation. That's going to get the inflammation under control very rapidly, and you'll notice a big difference with that. This also gets back to where we're talking about having a foundation. These patches are signaling mechanisms. So they're sending the body the instructions that it needs, that it lost the time to do certain things like turning back on copper peptide. But if you don't have adequate amounts of protein in the diet, if you don't have healthy fats, if you're not drinking enough water, you won't be able to make enough energy. If you haven't built up your foundation, you're not going to get the best benefits out of this. So this is why you always want to go back and review, what's my diet like? Am I getting enough nutrition? Am I getting enough rest? Do I have enough protein? Which is actually a very tricky question because the protein needs change significantly as we age. Are you doing all of these things? Even the way that we eat is important relative to tissue repair. So, for example, let's say that you're practicing fasting. Well, if you're fasting, if you're eating, let's say you're practicing intermittent fasting, and you're eating within an 8-hour window, well, during that 16 hours, your body is going through a process called autophagy, and the body now is going to turn on mechanisms to tear down damaged tissue. This is why in new research, so let's say if you're over the age of 50, there is going to be, depending on who you are, your lifestyle, you're going to have an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And cardiovascular disease, interestingly enough, is being linked to insulin, amongst other things. You do something that doesn't cost you any money, practice intermittent fasting, it can reduce body fat and improve body composition, because if you're not eating, you need to get the energy from somewhere, so it's going to come from stored body fat, so you're getting that growth hormone boost. But anyway, so this is all to say, to get the most and best use out of the patches, think about these things about your daily life program, and design and engineer a program for your daily life that's right for you, that includes all of these pinnacles of health. So, I've spoken enough, and I'd like to give the opportunity. I'm going to stay a little while. It's okay. But I'd like to hear from you. So this will be a time where we can take some questions.